Hi, it's Frank, and today what I wanted to talk about was some voice leading. Voice leading is going to take us ultimately, it's going to lead us, if you'll pardon the pun, to how to harmonize a melody. Harmonizing a melody means putting chords to it. Before we talk about doing something like that, we want to have a little bit of groundwork laid for how we go about moving notes around to get from one chord to the next. Now, part of this we've talked about when we've talked about triads and inversions and moving those around. But today I want to get a little more specific with how we're doing that. The PDF that's linked in the description offers a short illustration using both first position chords you're probably already familiar with via the chord boxes, and then also some triad shapes in the actual tab and notation that are below the chord boxes. What I've done is I've taken 3 different progressions, 2 short ones and a longer one, and I've mapped those out using, again, both the first position chords, stuff like G or E minor, for instance, and then also filled in how those progressions can move even more smoothly when we break those triads down in such a way that we are moving just by either half step or step for the most part, utilizing notes that are common to each chord. So what I mean by that can be found in the very first example there. First example involves 2 measures, and it uses the progression 1, 6, 2, 5. You may recall from previous videos, this is a pretty common progression. By the way, for now, all the examples on the PDF are in the key of G. So 1, 6, 2, 5 would mean that the 1 chord is G, the 5 chord is D. Those are both major. Our 6th chord in this key, our submedian in other words, would be E minor, and our supertonic or 2nd degree chord would be A minor. So we've got a nice balance between major and minor chords here. Again, we're completely diatonic. So if I was to strum through those 4 chords, there's a certain amount of commonality even in those first position chords that makes things sound fairly smooth. That's partly why that progression is so well established regardless of how I play the chords. However, if you look at those chords and the way they're moving when you're strumming them as first position chords, you'll notice there's some octave jumping going around so that we can find the common tones. If I go ahead and reduce that progression, those 4 chords, to just triads along the first string, what I get is something that sounds like this. Notice as I did that, I had very little movement. That's because, as it turns out, common tones allow for me to move from one chord to the next very smoothly. That's why you've already been working on voice leading if you've covered first position chords. All we're seeking to do at this moment is refine that understanding so we can add to it. Once again, the idea here was if I start with my G chord in the first inversion, to get to an E minor from here, all I have to do is add the note E, because G and B are already common to both chords. From that E minor chord, all I have to do to get to A minor is simply bring down both an A and a C, because E is already common to both E minor and A minor. And then to get from A minor to D, I add 2 notes, because the A is already common to both A minor and D. So even if there's only a single common tone, that helps make things that much smoother when you're moving around. This is something which is deployed all the time in arranging, and also, I would say arguably for soloists, because soloists understand how to connect chords in an interesting way while also balancing the need to make sure there's some sort of smoothness happening. It's not to say you always want smoothness. Of course, the idea of chromatic movement or secondary dominance is the whole idea of adding some spice to your arrangements, or specifically your chord progressions, by introducing notes that aren't expected. But for the most part, voice leading is all about trying to move from one chord to the next through a whole progression or series of chords in a section while keeping things as smooth as possible. That usually involves common tones, like I'm demonstrating here, and the idea that you're moving mostly in steps, or even at most small skips, for instance, a third at most. So once again, that was the first example. The other 2 examples in here are similar. The next one begins in the 3rd measure, and it once again starts in the key of G, but notice here I'm actually starting in the 2nd inversion, then moving to a C, which is slightly higher, then moving downward to E minor. Now the E minor actually shares 2 notes that are actually common with the C, so that kind of movement is pretty easy. From there I move downward to D. Now here's an example in moving from E minor to D as in dog, where there are no common tones between the chords. That does happen, of course, and it's not that that's wrong. The idea here, though, is that I'm trying to go ahead and emphasize a movement toward the dominant chord. Again, we're in the key of G and this is D. Toward that will eventually move toward the tonic chord. So there are times for sure when you don't necessarily want a lot of commonality because you want the chord you're landing on or about to land on to stand out more. But in general terms, even then, the movement is pretty smooth. Again, if you break down what I did, which is a little easier to see, I think, in the PDF via either tab or notation, you can see the movement downward towards the D chord involved mostly single steps, whole steps. Okay? The final progression actually adds a few chords. This one's 4 measures long and allows you to move down the neck. And again, we've seen some of this kind of movement before. I just want to get a little more into why it works the way it works. That's the reason why we're talking about voice leading. Starting in that 5th measure on the PDF, we have a G chord that moves downward to B minor, the 3 chord, then moves very smoothly to an E minor chord because notes are shared between B as in boy and E minor, and then to a C chord, 2 notes shared there, and then to a D as in dog in first inversion where there are no shared tones between that and C, and finally to an F sharp diminished, which shares 2 notes with the D as in dog chord, and then a G chord. So once again, that diminished chord in this case, F sharp A C, had no common tones with the chord I was going to. But all the notes in this case are moving in the right direction to make it sound like I'm heading toward a final resolution. That idea of taking notes and moving them in certain directions is stuff we'll cover in future videos. For now, again, I just wanted to introduce this idea of common tones. And by the way, on the PDF, just to highlight things and make it a little easier to see, whenever we have a chord other than the 1 chord, I've put in red the notes that are actually common to the previous chord. So for instance, beginning with the 1st measure, the G chord moving to the E minor chord. In the E minor chord, the 2 tones that are common are highlighted in red. They happen to be the notes G and B as in boy. Not in the tab, but in the notation itself. You've already hopefully gotten comfortable reading notes, or even if you haven't per se, you can still see the number of common tones that are moving as you go from one chord to the next across these 3 examples. Okay? All right, well, that's it for this week. We'll go ahead and continue talking a little more about voice leading before, like I said, we finally start looking at some examples of how to go ahead and take a melody and add some chords to it. Take care.